I was gone for exactly 8 days. That's all it took. 8 days helping my older brother work cattle on his spread up near the Montana line. 8 days sleeping in a bunkhouse, eating dust, fixing fences, and dealing with animals that weighed more than my pickup truck. When I finally headed home, I remember feeling relieved. There's something about seeing your own land after being away that settles your nerves. My ranch wasn't fancy, never tried to be. 47 acres of pasture, a weathered red barn, a modest house my father built with his own hands, and a fence line along the western edge that had stood there longer than some people had been alive. I knew every inch of that property, every gate, every cedar post, every low spot that flooded after heavy rain. That's why the moment I drove down my gravel driveway, my stomach tightened. Something looked wrong. At first I couldn't figure out what it was. The view felt different somehow. Cleaner, straighter, almost artificial. Then I saw it. The old fence was gone. Every last section of rusted barbed wire had vanished. The cedar posts my grandfather helped install decades earlier had disappeared too. In their place stood a tall cream-colored vinyl privacy fence, perfectly aligned, perfectly polished, stretching hundreds of feet along the road frontage. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd somehow taken the wrong turn and driven onto somebody else's property. Then I noticed the giant stone monument attached near the road. It stood nearly 6 feet high with expensive landscaping around the base. Bright flowers, decorative rock, spotlights, and carved across the center in elegant lettering were the words, "Welcome to Meadow Ridge Estates." I just sat there staring through my windshield. Meadow Ridge Estates was the new subdivision built next to my ranch. A few years earlier, the land east of me had been pasture too, but developers bought it and transformed it into what they marketed as luxury country living. Big houses, 3-car garages, decorative lanterns, matching mailboxes, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn looked like it was trimmed with a ruler. I never had problems with it before. We stayed on our side. They stayed on theirs. At least that's what I thought. I parked and walked straight toward the fence. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Whoever built it hadn't simply replaced the old boundary fence. They had moved it. I didn't need a measuring tape to see that. The entire line sat noticeably deeper into my pasture. 10 feet at least, maybe more. Standing there, I felt that strange kind of anger that doesn't explode immediately. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. The kind where your brain starts connecting dots before your mouth starts yelling. Then I found the envelope. It was taped to the side of my barn door like some kind of afterthought. No certified mail. No phone call. No meeting request. Just a plain white envelope flapping in the breeze. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Boundary adjustment completed in accordance with community development plans. Thank you for your cooperation. That was it. No signature. No explanation. No apology. I actually laughed when I read it because it was so absurd. Cooperation? I hadn't even been there. Somebody had apparently decided they could redesign part of my property while I was out of town and then thank me afterward. That's when I walked back to my office and pulled out the original survey records. My family had owned that ranch for generations, and my father believed in documenting everything. Every deed, every easement, every survey was neatly organized in filing cabinets. 2 hours later, I was standing along the property line, searching for the original survey pins. The developers apparently assumed nobody would bother checking. Big mistake. I found the first marker buried beneath fresh dirt. Then another. Then another. Every pin sat exactly where it had always been. The legal boundary hadn't moved an inch. They hadn't corrected anything. They hadn't discovered some historical error. They had simply ignored the line and built wherever they wanted. The more I calculated the numbers, the worse it became. 10 feet doesn't sound dramatic when you hear it, but spread across more than 600 feet of road frontage, that's a massive strip of land. Valuable frontage land. And they hadn't just installed a fence. The stone monument sat on a concrete foundation extending deep underground. Fresh irrigation lines ran beneath the landscaping. Decorative lighting had already been installed. Somebody spent serious money building this entrance. Somebody approved plans. Somebody signed permits. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. The question wasn't whether they made a mistake. The question was whether they thought I'd be too intimidated, too distracted, or too uninformed to challenge them. That evening, I watched traffic flowing through their entrance from my porch. New residents drove in and out completely unaware that part of the road they were using belonged to me. The subdivision looked peaceful from a distance, almost picturesque. But beneath all that polished stone and manicured grass sat a problem nobody inside those expensive homes realized existed yet. Because while they thought they had successfully moved my fence 10 feet, what they didn't understand was that moving the fence also changed something else. Something much more important. Their entire entrance road had shifted with it. And the moment I confirmed that suspicion, I knew this story was about to become very expensive for somebody. It just wasn't going to be me. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me explain something, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand property disputes. According to standard procedure, property lines aren't suggestions. They're legal boundaries backed by surveys, deeds, county records, and a whole lot of paperwork that judges tend to take very seriously. From a legal perspective, it doesn't matter if a contractor made a mistake, if an HOA approved something, or if a developer already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building it. If the structure sits on somebody else's land, the problem doesn't magically disappear. But here's the part one find fascinating. This is a psychological trap many HOAs and developers fall into. They spend so much money creating an impressive appearance that they start believing appearance is reality. They assume the smaller landowner will back down because fighting seems inconvenient. The lesson here is simple. Confidence is not ownership. Just because someone acts like they own something doesn't mean they actually do. And the people who understand that difference usually end up controlling the outcome. The next morning, I called a licensed survey company that had worked in the county for decades. I didn't tell them what I thought happened. I just asked them to establish the legal boundary and document everything. 2 days later, 3 surveyors arrived with GPS equipment, tripods, metal detectors, and enough paperwork to make a government office jealous. I followed them around most of the afternoon while they checked coordinates, located the original markers, verified deed descriptions, and compared everything against county records. Around sunset, the lead surveyor walked over holding a clipboard and gave me a look that said he already knew exactly why I hired him. "You're going to want to see this," he said. Bright orange flags now stretched across the entire frontage. The legal property line ran in a perfectly straight path. The problem for Meadow Ridge Estates was that the line didn't stop at their fancy fence. It cut directly through their entrance road, right down the middle. I stared at those flags for a long moment and honestly had a laugh. They hadn't stolen a decorative corner of pasture. They had built half of their primary entrance on my property. Every moving truck, every delivery vehicle, every potential home buyer, every resident entering that subdivision was crossing land they did not own. Suddenly, the stone sign wasn't the biggest issue anymore. The road was. And without that road, their entire development had a serious problem. Now, a lot of people would have driven straight to the HOA office and started screaming. That's never been my style. Anger makes people careless. Evidence makes them nervous. So instead of creating a scene, I made a phone call to a towing company, rented several portable barriers, and positioned my tractor exactly where the survey showed my property began. I parked it across the disputed section of roadway. Hazard lights blinking. Engine off. Then I unfolded a lawn chair beside it, poured myself a cup of coffee, and waited. The timing couldn't have been better if I'd planned it 6 months in advance. That weekend happened to be Meadow Ridge's biggest open house event of the year. Realtors had advertisements running across 3 counties. Potential buyers were arriving from all over the state. The first wave showed up around 8:30. They slowed, stared, then stopped. Some rolled down their windows. Others took photos. One guy asked if there had been an accident. "Nope," I said. "Property dispute." He immediately grabbed his phone and started recording. By 10 o'clock, traffic was backed halfway to the highway. By 11, it stretched even farther. Realtors were sweating. Sales agents were making frantic calls. Homeowners were complaining. And I sat there calmly drinking coffee while watching chaos spread through a subdivision that had apparently assumed I wouldn't notice 10 feet of missing land. Around noon, the HOA president arrived. His name was Brent Calloway. Brent looked exactly like the kind of guy who introduced himself before mentioning his title. Expensive sunglasses, crisp polo shirt, perfect haircut, permanent smile that somehow never reached his eyes. He marched toward me carrying a folder. "You're obstructing a private road," he said. I took another sip of coffee and handed him the survey. "You're using private property." He looked at the paperwork. His smile disappeared almost immediately. "There must be some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. Our contractors followed approved plans." "Then your contractors follow the wrong plans." He shifted tactics. "Let's be reasonable here." That's usually what people say right before asking somebody else to accept something unreasonable. "I've been reasonable," I replied. "For 8 days while you build on my land." His jaw tightened. He glanced back toward the growing traffic jam. The situation was becoming impossible to hide. Homebuyers were watching. Residents were gathering. Social media videos were already spreading. Nothing terrifies an HOA faster than public embarrassment. Brent left without another word. I figured I'd hear from lawyers soon. I was right. That afternoon, I filed formal complaints for trespass and land encroachment. Then I made another call. This one went to the county planning office. The woman who answered probably expected a routine question. Instead, I asked something very specific. Did Meadow Ridge Estates receive approval to relocate their primary entrance? There was a pause. Keyboard clicking. More silence. Then she said, "No. According to our records, the approved entrance location remains where it was originally submitted." That answer changed everything. Up until that moment, the HOA's biggest problem was a property dispute. Now, they potentially had a permitting issue too. The county doesn't enjoy surprises involving infrastructure, especially entrances connected to public roads. By the third day, the entire development seemed to be unraveling. Buyers visiting open houses started asking uncomfortable questions. If the entrance wasn't legal, what else wasn't legal? If the HOA ignored property lines, what other rules were being ignored? Realtors hate uncertainty because uncertainty kills sales. Residents were angry about traffic backups. Contractors couldn't move equipment efficiently. Delivery drivers complained. Every hour the situation continued, the pressure increased. Late that afternoon, Brent returned. This time he brought an attorney. The lawyer introduced himself politely, which I appreciated. He at least understood the reality of the situation. We stood beside the stone monument while traffic crawled past. "Our clients would like to resolve this quickly," he said. "That's a good idea," I answered. The first offer arrived almost immediately. They would remove the fence, remove the landscaping, remove the monument sign, restore the original boundary. A few days earlier that might have worked, but not anymore. "No," I said. Both men looked surprised. Brent looked especially surprised. People like Brent spend their lives assuming money solves every problem. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it arrives too late. "What do you mean no?" he asked. I pointed toward the entrance. "You've already excavated, graded, poured concrete, installed irrigation, added electrical systems, planted landscaping, and rerouted traffic patterns. Restoration isn't a simple weekend project anymore." The lawyer nodded slowly. He understood. Brent didn't. "Then what exactly do you want?" he asked. Finally, we arrived at the real conversation. I pulled out a folder containing my calculations. Commercial frontage rates, survey costs, legal fees, market valuations, everything documented. "You have 2 options," I said. "Option 1, remove everything, close the entrance, restore the land, obtain new approvals, and start over. Option 2, purchase a permanent easement." The lawyer immediately focused on the second option. Brent looked like he wanted to pretend it didn't exist. I continued. "You pay commercial frontage value for every square foot. You reimburse every survey expense, every filing fee, every legal cost. You compensate me for unauthorized use. Then you sign a permanent easement agreement that protects both sides." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Cars continued creeping through the traffic bottleneck. Residents watched from a distance. Brent finally shook his head. "That's outrageous." I smiled. "So, is moving somebody else's fence?" The lawyer asked for 48 hours. I gave them exactly 48 hours. During those 2 days, I heard rumors from real estate agents, contractors, and even a few residents. Home sales were slowing. Questions were multiplying. Investors were nervous. The entrance road had become a liability nobody could ignore. 46 hours later, Brent and the attorney returned. This time Brent wasn't smiling at all. The paperwork was already prepared. They accepted the easement. They accepted the compensation. They accepted the fees. Every demand. We signed. The county recorded the agreement. The dispute officially ended. And just like that, the entrance remained exactly where it sat. The landscaping stayed. The stone monument stayed. The road stayed. The difference was that now every inch of disputed property was legally accounted for, properly documented, and permanently compensated. They thought they had gained 10 feet of land. Instead, they created a payment obligation attached to their development for years to come. Every resident entering Meadow Ridge Estates still drives beneath that impressive stone sign. Every visitor still passes through that beautiful entrance. Everything looks exactly the way the developers originally intended. But hidden beneath the concrete, landscaping, and polished appearance is a reminder that ownership isn't determined by confidence, money, or assumptions. It's determined by facts. And in the end, the facts never moved, even when my fence did. A few months after everything was settled, I found myself sitting on the same porch where this whole story really began, watching vehicles roll through that entrance like nothing had ever happened. The landscaping had matured. The flowers were blooming. The monument sign looked just as polished as the day they installed it. If you drove past without knowing the history, you'd probably assume everything had always been that way. That's the funny thing about conflicts like these. Most people only see the finished picture. They don't see the decisions, assumptions, mistakes, and power plays hiding underneath the surface. Every now and then a resident from Meadow Ridge recognizes me at the local diner or hardware store. Some of them know exactly who I am. A few have even thanked me, not because they enjoyed the dispute, but because they realized something important afterward. If a developer can ignore one property owner today, they can ignore someone else tomorrow. Rules only matter when they apply equally to everyone. That's something my father taught me long before I ever dealt with HOAs, attorneys, or county offices. He used to say that character reveals itself when people think nobody is watching. Looking back, that's exactly what happened here. Somebody assumed I was gone. Somebody assumed I wouldn't notice. Somebody assumed a polished entrance and an expensive development would outweigh a survey map and a property deed. They weren't evil. That's what makes situations like this interesting. Most conflicts aren't created by cartoon villains. They're created by arrogance, convenience, and the belief that consequences probably won't arrive. Unfortunately for them, consequences eventually showed up driving a tractor. According to standard procedure, property disputes are usually resolved through documentation, surveys, and negotiation. That's the boring answer. The internet loves dramatic revenge stories, but the reality is that paperwork often wins where anger fails. If I had stormed into their office yelling, I probably would have looked unreasonable. If I had damaged their property, I would have created legal problems for myself. Instead, I let the facts do the heavy lifting. From a legal perspective, ownership is one of the strongest rights people have. That's why courts, counties, and surveyors place so much emphasis on records and boundaries. The documents don't care who has more money. They don't care who has the larger development. They don't care who has the fancier lawyer. They care about evidence. And evidence tends to be remarkably stubborn. But there's another layer to this story that has nothing to do with property law. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere in life. Sometimes people become so invested in a plan that they stop questioning whether the plan is actually right. They start believing momentum equals permission. The project gets bigger, more expensive, and more public, and eventually they convince themselves nobody will challenge it because too much has already been built. That's exactly why some of the biggest mistakes happen near the finish line. People stop checking. They stop listening. They stop asking hard questions. The lesson here is not that every HOA is bad. I've met good HOA boards and terrible HOA boards. I've met honest developers and dishonest developers. The lesson here is that boundaries matter. Not just property boundaries, but personal boundaries too. When somebody crosses a line and faces no resistance, crossing the next line becomes easier. Whether it's business, family, friendships, or land ownership, people often learn how far they can go by seeing what others tolerate. That's why standing your ground matters, even when doing so feels inconvenient. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't loud. Sometimes it's calm, documented, and impossible to argue with. I still chuckle whenever I drive past that entrance because I remember how confident everyone seemed in the beginning. They thought they were expanding something. In reality, they were creating an obligation that would follow them long after the ribbon-cutting ceremony ended. And honestly, that's probably the most satisfying part. Not the money, not the victory, not even the embarrassment they experienced during that open house weekend. The satisfying part is knowing the outcome was fair. Nobody lost their homes. Nobody got destroyed financially. Nobody was humiliated in court. The problem was identified, documented, and corrected. Justice doesn't always have to look dramatic. Sometimes justice looks like a signed agreement and a monthly payment. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered a developer had moved your fence 10 feet onto your property while you were gone, would you have accepted their first apology and let them move everything back? Or would you have pushed for the easement the way I did? Let me know down in the comments, because I guarantee people are going to disagree on this one. And if you enjoy stories about HOA drama, property disputes, small-town conflicts, and legal revenge that actually stays inside the law, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next story. Trust me, this wasn't the last time somebody underestimated a quiet landowner with good records and a lot of patience.